evening. 2 days after the worst terror attack in Manchester, 8 people are under arrest. But authorities fear the worst may not be over yet. Tonight on Gravitas, we put the pieces together to bring you the profile of a homegrown terrorist in Britain. What drove him to blow up young people like himself? Why is it so tough to identify potential terrorists in a country like the UK? Is it just intelligence failure, or is the West reaping the fruit of its flawed, long-standing policy to support insurgencies to topple hostile regimes? I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. The headlines first. Britain, angry over intelligence leaks, is set to confront the US in Brussels. Manchester police decide to not share any further information about the attack with the Americans. US sends a Navy warship in the disputed South China Sea, citing freedom of navigation. China calls it a provocation, violating its sovereignty. 2 suicide attackers unleash carnage at the Jakarta bus station, sending clouds of black smoke and making people flee in panic. ISIS claims responsibility. And despite rifts over Syria, Ukraine and cyber attacks, the presidents of France and Russia set up a surprise meeting to fast-track dialogue. Macron will host Putin next Monday. And also on the show, the Philippines is a war zone. President Duterte has threatened to extend martial law to the entire country. But why are citizens skeptical? We'll talk about that. And after calling NATO obsolete and Brussels a hellhole, US President Donald Trump is attending his first NATO summit in that very city. We'll tell you what to expect. But first, to what's happening in Manchester, a clearer picture is emerging of the Manchester bomber Salman Abedi, a Briton of Libyan descent, radicalised abroad only to return to the UK and commit an act of terror. WION's Mandy Clark has the profile of the killer.
Salman Abedi was born and raised in Manchester in 1994 to Libyan-born refugees. They had fled to the UK to escape Gaddafi's regime. He seemed a normal kid growing up and used to drink alcohol up until a year ago, according to his friends. He went to Salford University in 2014, studying business management before dropping out. His parents returned to Libya, and he made frequent trips to Tripoli, visiting his family. But it is believed from Libya he made the trip to Syria and was radicalized there. He had just returned from a 3-week trip from Libya when he attacked Manchester Arena. Police believe Abedi got bomb-making terror training in the war-torn country in preparation for this attack. Abdi fits the profile of a homegrown terrorist. They're often second-generation immigrants who struggle to integrate into society. They don't stand out from a crowd, though. That is their greatest skills, to mix seamlessly within a crowd because they understand the culture. His father is under arrest in Libya in the fast-moving investigation. He has known al-Qaeda links, but denies his son was involved in the bombing, saying, "We don't believe in killing innocents." Abedi's younger brother, Hashim, who is also arrested in Tripoli, is suspected of having ISIS connections. His older brother remains in custody in Manchester and held for questioning. It appears he may have known his brother was planning the attack. A female believed to be his sister was arrested but has now been released. The worry for security services is that Abedi was part of a wider terror network that has attacks in the late stages of planning. For police, it's a race against time to close down the terror network before it can strike again. Mandy Clark, WION, London.
And joining us for more on this, we have Glenn Carl, American writer and former intelligence officer, joining us from Massachusetts. Joel Whitaker, security analyst, with us from London, and Mandy Clark, our bureau chief, WION bureau chief in London. Good evening to all of you. Mandy, let's start with you and the latest on the investigation. Reports say that the probe has now spread to Germany amid fears that the bomb maker might still be at large.
Yes, the network of this terror ring seems to be widening and widening. There's also speculation that Abedi was in contact with the man who was responsible for the Belgium attack just last year. So it seems that this is a widespread planned attack. It's not surprising that has moved borders, because a lot of these terror attacks may happen in one location, but there's chatter and connections to many other locations. So it is a fast-moving investigation with lots of arrests happening one after another. And last night in Manchester, we saw numerous raids because they were really looking for the bomb-making factory, because they believe there is one, and other plots in the late stages of planning.
Joel, the threat level in the UK remains critical. Should it be understood that the authorities admit that they still remain vulnerable to a follow-up attack or more?
Yeah, absolutely. To put the threat alert level at critical, its threat is imminent. So they actually expect another attack to happen quite soon. It's not surprising, really, for the bomb maker to have let off such a large device. There's no way he could have done it on his own. He needed assistance. And it's the assistance that he got within the UK, of course, that so worried the security services, hence why we're at critical. We don't know where the bomb maker or makers are. We may not know where the rest of the cell, if it's a group of terrorists, are. So the British security services are quickly trying to track them down as fast as they can.
Glenn Carl, the intelligence leaks have come in for a lot of criticism, and the British authorities say that they seriously undermine an ongoing investigation. How serious is that leak?
Well, I think it's quite serious. You'd never want to reveal, if you're an intelligence service or a law enforcement agency involved in an investigation, what you know. If you reveal what you know, then the people you are trying to find and stop have tools, information that they can use to mask themselves, change their locations, alter their practices. So it's a very bad thing. From the operational perspective, it's also quite bad from the perspective of relations between the closest allies that there are, the United States and Great Britain. It's completely understandable that the British services become wary of sharing information with a country or an agency that will then give it to the press. It's a very bad thing.
And how much does it affect American credibility? First, the president being involved allegedly in quote-unquote leaking information to the Russians, and now this.
Right. Well, I suppose that it has the merit of being consistent in bad behavior. It completely undermines credibility. If the chief of state can't willfully gives away vitally sensitive information, whatever his formal legal authority, then it will harm, as it has already, their relations with NATO for the United States, with Great Britain bilaterally, with Israel, and on, and countries that haven't yet been victimized by these incompetent or willfully bad acts will, of course, hesitate and change their practices so that they are not victimized too. It's all bad.
Mandy, the intelligence leaks may have further compromised an investigation, but to start with, there was an intelligence failure as well. Just like with the Westminster attacker, this man was on the radar, then he went off the radar. If his travel pattern, if his behavioral pattern is to be discussed, it should have raised some red flags.
Yeah, he was certainly on a watch list. He was well known to authorities, and there's a lot of questions being asked now on why they weren't following him more closely. And when he came back into country, a lot of security services said they simply don't have enough watchers. They don't have enough officers to constantly monitor all the people who are on the watch list. And there are said to be thousands of potential potential terrorists on the watch list. Now, everyone on the watch list won't necessarily become a terrorist. They might just have radical sympathies, but they may change their minds. So it is with caution they use the watch list. They don't want to do sweeping arrests like they did in the past in Northern Ireland, because it led to a lot of animosity in that community. It created more tension and ultimately more terror. So they're trying to work with the community, but just use intelligence to follow these people and watch them. But they simply say they don't have enough resources to follow every person that could pose a threat.
Right, and if I could just quote UK Home Secretary Amber Rudd, who admitted that Abedi was, quote-unquote, somebody that they had known, but only up to a point, meaning that while something had alerted intelligence agencies to his activity, he was not deemed significant enough a threat to be tracked more closely. Joel Whitaker, my question to you is this: as someone who has worked closely with such agencies, how difficult is it to gauge the threat level of someone like Abedi?
It is tough, and the security services in any country are a huge amount reliant upon the local population to feed them information. That did happen. It did happen in the UK in this instance, where a concerned relative, where concerned friends had got in touch with the UK security services and said that they were worried about the rhetoric with which this terrorist was talking. There's behaviours that worried the local population too. So they did inform the local UK security services. Now, it's obviously there's a lot of terrorist activity or potential terrorist activity, particularly over the last few years. So that's a lot of data for the security services to sift through. And so it's an incredibly tough task to find out actually somebody who is just a sympathiser, who perhaps flies a flag, who perhaps watches videos of terrorist action, to somebody who actually will carry it out. And it's a very small percentage of people who actually will carry out such a heinous act like what we saw in Manchester. But yeah, it's an incredibly tough job for the security services in any country, certainly in the UK.
Right, I'm going to request you to all stay with us. Let's listen in to what Prime Minister Theresa May had to say after chairing the meeting of the Elite Cobra Committee.
Just chaired a meeting of COBRA where I was updated on the extraordinary response of the police and emergency services to Monday's horrific attack. The police have confirmed that 8 suspects remain in custody and that progress is being made in the case. But the threat level, as assessed by the Independent Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, will remain at critical, and the public should remain vigilant. I was also briefed on Operation Tempora. Around 1,000 members of the armed forces are assisting the police, providing important reassurance ahead of a bank holiday weekend of busy events. Shortly, I will be travelling to the NATO summit, where I will be working with international colleagues on defeating terrorism. I will make clear to President Trump that intelligence that is shared between our law enforcement agencies must remain secure.
Intelligence shared between law enforcement agencies must remain secure, says the British Prime Minister. Glenn Carl, this also puts the focus back on the so-called homegrown terror. This was second-generation Libyan who grew up in Manchester, and the entire debate over immigration then once again comes into the spotlight.
Well, there are 2 critical points that we've touched upon here and that are the big challenges for intelligence law enforcement agencies when trying to identify terrorists and stopping them. And one is almost always, regularly at least, the agencies relevant will have information that indicates so-and-so is a person of interest, as was the case with this Manchester attack. That happens over and over. The dilemma, as Joel pointed out, is how do you know to distinguish between alarming tough talk and someone who actually is going to act? And even when you do that, when you know that, to decide when is the person going to become operational. You can't sweep people up without cause without something that you can use in court. That is a terrible dilemma for all Western law enforcement and intelligence agencies. The second one is on how do you identify and stop homegrown jihadists. The borders actually are almost they're secondary. It's the world of ideas and data bits now that is the central challenge, and one that is impossible really to stop, because so long as there is an internet, opinions will be shared, and that's a vital value of Western democracies also, a good thing. So you have to not shut down information, but try to address the almost unanswerable dilemma of how to identify people who are affected because they are disaffected socially. That's the challenge that has been for well over a decade and will continue to be so.
Right. One of the other debates that has arisen from this tragedy in Manchester, of course, is the utter failure to coordinate and use intelligence exchange between the two major Western powers and the closest allies, the US and the UK. But is there a more deeper, really, meaning to this? Is there more to the relentless wave of terror that Western nations are facing today? Are those who fight Islamist terror today responsible for creating it as well? Senior international correspondent Padma Rao examines that question.
Demonize a ruler who refuses to share crude oil or other assets, build up public support, then vanquish the tin pot dictator and win the next election. Democrat or Republican, Tory or Labour, this has been the policy that the Western world's two closest allies, the United States and the United Kingdom, have adamantly followed since World War II. The objects of desire are new, but the weapon an age-old one: divide and rule, one that left no former British colony untouched. The Cold War era, Afghanistan under Soviet occupation in the 80s, Washington supported and armed anti-Soviet militants, even radical Islamists among them. The Soviets withdrew, US interest waned, and its earlier armed protégés were abandoned. Monster number one, the Mujahideen, was born. Then came the Taliban, and finally the umbrella Islamist terror group, the Al-Qaeda. Secular state Iraq's ruthless despot was no angel. Saddam Hussein decimated opponents. Human rights abuse, the touchstone of the West, allowed the US-UK coalition to invade. Hussein was taken out, a puppet Shiite regime put in place, and out of millions of disgruntled Sunnis, the Al-Qaeda of Iraq, which later became the Islamic State, came to life. Salman Abedi, the murderous fanatic from Libya who blew himself up and took 22 innocent lives in Manchester last week, is predominantly a product of US and UK policy. The West's interest in the North African country lay primarily in crude oil, liquid gold for the energy-starved world. It was Democrat President Barack Obama who allowed US support for groups trying to topple Libyan ruler Muammar Gaddafi. Abedi's father belonged to one such group. They met with chilling success. Creating rifts, taking sides, then withdrawing in indifference, these murderous monsters were born of the West, and now they've returned to haunt the West. The parents of the innocent victims of last week's terror will never be able to gaze at pictures of their loved ones without unbearable grief. But they must hold a mirror to their leaders, for it is they who have come the full murderous circle yet again. Padma Rao, WION.
Mandy, while the people in Manchester are suffering after this tragedy, has anyone in the UK questioned their own government's long-standing policy of supporting insurgencies that come back to haunt them?
No, that's not a conversation that is happening now. You know, there was many reasons why countries went to war, and certainly there's many speculations on why they went to war in Afghanistan, and in Iraq and Libya. Certainly the countries didn't say we're going in for crude oil. There's lots of speculation that was the motive behind it, and we can have a debate on that. But at the time, There was the population here in the UK were strongly against the Iraq war. There were mass protests with millions of people. There was a Stop the War coalition. So it wasn't necessarily reflective at the time of the country's will. They went in a coalition with the United States. Libya, Muammar Gaddafi was not very kind to his own population. I was on the ground in Libya in 2011. It was a very dangerous situation. And at the time, many people welcomed the help of NATO putting that no-fly zone. So I don't know if we can boil it down to a war for crude oil. I don't know if that diminishes all the reasons that we go to war.
Very well put. Joel, but that is one argument that is often put out, that the West's experiments with democracy elsewhere sometimes prove too costly for their own people.
Yeah, but let's not forget, the Libyan revolution was a revolution from within, much like the whole of the Arab Spring was. It was perpetrated by and started by not only the youth, but certainly the youth of the country. When you looked at Libya, but anyway, it was the population of Libya that rose up against what they felt was a dictator Gaddafi. So they actually rose up and asked for democracy. It wasn't actually the US or the UK that sort of started to go in there after oil or whatever the reasons are that are speculated. So, and that's happened quite a lot across the world. That countries have risen up. But of course, Western powers have gone in, as we've seen in Afghanistan and other countries, Iraq, where perhaps they should, as Mandy said. At the time, certainly when you look at Iraq in 2003, huge protests, etc., the general population in the UK did not want the UK government to go into Iraq. They really did protest against it. And yet you see the bombing in Manchester, to put it into context, was against the UK population. It wasn't against the government. They didn't blow the government up, they blew up innocent civilians. So it's a big disparity. Yeah, not a great situation at all. A tough one I would imagine to remedy looking ahead, with Western powers having their feet in so many different countries. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily just the West that sort of starts these fights. Often in Libya, it was started internally.
Glenn Carl, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is an issue that we've spent huge amounts of energy trying to analyze, and the way we frame it is quite different, really, than the report, which I think is too passive intellectually and puts the only agency and responsibility on the external actors, which would be the Western powers. The way we frame it is, do they hate us for what we do or for who we are? And the answer is actually both. However, we have quantified response to this. We interviewed many of the detainees, most of the detainees, and foreign fighters, we call them, non-Iraqis who went to fight against the Americans in Iraq. Just one example, but we've done it also elsewhere. And overwhelmingly, what motivated the, quote, foreign fighters and the jihadists was what we did. So that does speak to a major part of your report. If we were not in Iraq, they wouldn't have been fighting mostly. However, another critical component is the who we are, meaning that perhaps I'll use a Christian term to speak about Islam. Ironically, the original sin, you could argue, wasn't colonialism, but rather the Wahhabi proselytization coming out of Riyadh, which has changed the nature of Islam in the last 50 years, so that people now feel empowered to kill innocents. That's not an act of the West. It is a response of Islamic civilization to globalization, to modernization, literacy, changing economic circumstances where traditional elites, the imam, no longer hold sway. And someone like this 22-year-old struggling, alienated individual feels empowered to make decisions of life and death. That's an infection in a way of the West, but it's also a good thing when people reason for themselves, which has, in this instance, tragic consequences. So it's both who we are and what we do. It's not just that imperial powers and neo-colonial powers are affecting poor innocents who are reacting with violence.
Right. I'm not trying to justify what this man did or any other terrorist did in the past, but do you at least admit that that it was external forces, mostly from the West, that first came and armed and funded these militias for whatever reasons, and then left, leaving a bigger mess sometimes behind them.
The U.S., after we effectively, through surrogates, defeated the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, no longer had an interest in Afghanistan. That is true. And we left, and what was a tribal society and barely a state reverted to a state of anarchy and its eternal warlord struggles. That's true. And we are responsible for that. We are not responsible for creating jihadism and the changed nature of an extreme segment of Islam.
Right. I'm going to leave it at that. A lot of food for thought here. Thanks very much, Mandy Clark, Joel Whitaker, and Glenn Carl. Appreciate all of you joining us here on the show. As we head into a break, it's not just the countries in the West that are fighting, but countries across the world are fighting the threat of terror. Up next, our focus on the Philippines. Do stay with us.